Hi, Stephen Bauman here, and I want to give you some legit tips and tricks that you can use to draw eyes better in your portraits. All of the clips that you're going to see in this video are taken from an in-depth lesson I made for my Patreon students, which you can get access to if you follow the link in the description of this video. It will take you directly to my Patreon page where for just $10, you can get access to this lesson and all of the other content that I've made for my Patreon students over the last 6 years. This includes my Anatomy for Portrait Artists course, my Start to Finish Atelier training program, and another lesson that my students have been really excited about called Composition for Portraiture. Anyway, that's where you can find me, so let's now get into the lesson. These two angle breaks tend to be pretty uniformly expressed across eyes. What you're going to find at the lower edge of the upper eyelid is a boundary that is influenced by the form of the cornea. Now, the cornea is just the rounded dome that's on top of the iris. So the iris is the colored section of the eye. Now, on top of that is a transparent dome, and that dome presses up into the form of the upper eyelid, meaning that the peak in the form of the upper eyelid is likely to be found also at the apex of that dome. Something else we can mention here that's significant, the visible portion of the white of the eye. Of course, the white of the eye can be referred to as the sclera, is usually about twice the distance of the iris. The lower eyelid tends to have its main angle break just along the edge of the outer third of its overall length. The lower eyelid has less of a distinct plane shift happening in between its form and the forms underneath it. For this reason, I try not to draw too clear a line in distinguishing where the boundary in between the lower eyelid and the form underneath it is. I like to just give it a light indication that shows that there is a form turning there, but maybe not one that is so crystal clear and distinct. Just here, where the eyeball itself contacts the lower eyelid, we can see a distance in between the beginning of that plane and the ending of that plane. This shows us essentially the depth of the lower eyelid and is a really key feature in expressing the perspective and the form of the eye. In regard to the upper eyelid, on this left-hand side we see almost nothing of that intermediate plane, whereas here on the outer half of the eyelid, where it's raised above the cornea and above the white of the eye here, we get an opportunity to see just a little bit of that downward facing plane. And I'm also going to indicate that here. The muscle that is responsible for the space around the eye and the eyelids is called Orbicularis oculi. This muscle has three distinct sections. There is the section that goes around the orbit, and then there is an upper and lower section that cover each of the eyelids. The upper eyelid, as it comes down and outward, overlaps the lower eyelid. Now, at the medial corner of the eye, where the upper eyelid and lower eyelid meet, we find a different situation altogether. What we find here is the tear duct. The upper eyelid rolls over the top of and down the medial edge of the tear duct. The lower eyelid does the same to the bottom edge, and again its form seems to curve up and underneath that of the upper eyelid. Let's go ahead and add some value to this also, so we sort of bring the drawing up to a level where we can talk about things other than just the linear boundaries of the eye. Now, while I'm here, why don't I bring up one of the very true things you need to know about the eye. Though its local color is relatively light, it's subject to the same lighting situation as the rest of the face. In this case, we have a light that's coming in from the upper left-hand side. It's creating highlights on these medial forms, and as the forms turn away, they're degrading in their value. So the white of the eye is just like any other sphere. As it turns away from the light, it will get darker. Let's go ahead and draw in the pupil as well. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to block in the highlight from the light source. On the side of the highlighted portion of the cornea tends to be a little bit darker, and on the opposite side it tends to be a little bit lighter. There is also slightly darker value around the edge of the iris as well. Little details like this tend to help bring the eye to life. Now, as I'm shading this eye further, you can start to see exactly how dark the white of the eye gets. This and this are really, really dark values when compared to the pure white of the paper. We need to build up a lot of value there. In fact, when we look at our source image, the up-facing plane of the lower eyelid reads as being lighter than the white of the eye. There's also a small highlight in the crevice in between the up-facing plane of the lower eyelid and the form of the eyeball itself. And let's talk a little bit about the forms that we find below the eye here. There is a sort of concentric arc that kind of goes from just about below the tear duct down and outward across the face. This indentation, this depression, is caused by something called the orbital retaining ligament. And the reason that it is a depression is that that ligament is also attached to the skin, meaning that any fat pads, like the fat pads that we have all over our face, and in specific in this section, a group called the suborbicularis fat pads, tend to bulge a little bit above and below that ligament. Now we can follow that form, that indentation, almost all the way around the eye. Now the eyebrow, a lot of times, is best expressed as a shape that rolls across the brow ridge. Initially, when you're drawing this area, I would recommend to start out with a bit of a value statement. But once you have that base statement, you can go through and create some strokes that show the overall direction of hair. There's something else about the lower eyelid I want to tell you about as I develop the value down there. But there is something called the lower lid skin crease, and it happens right about here. As the lower lid is coming up towards the tear duct and tightening, we have a more clear delineation of form than we have at the outer edge of the lid. Often develops this crease which travels downward and laterally out until it dissipates somewhere around here. Search for this on your models. Very often you're going to find it. I'm sure you could see it on my face if this were a super tight 8K video, but here we see it a little bit less. There is a hint of it in the source image, but I wanted to bring it up because it is a significant feature when you're drawing the values in that area. Now, very often when we're drawing in the tear duct, we see a variety of highlight information. It's mostly because what's inside this tear duct is not a single thing. We have two different entities here. We have most medially something called the caruncula lachrymalis. Then, in between that and the eyeball itself, we have another section. This is called the plica semilunaris, and it's a small crescent-shaped fold that sits in between these two features. Very often, you're going to find a separated highlight. Some highlights on the caruncula and some on the plica. So being that the eye is rounded like this, and that we're seeing more of the side of it here, and the side of it here, and the apex of it here, the eyelashes also respond to that perspective. So the eyelashes in the central area tend to go straight up. The eyelashes that we see at the outer edge here tend to be a little bit more horizontal, as well as the eyelashes that we see towards the medial section of the eye tilt outward to be a little bit more horizontal. The lower eyelashes are not dissimilar in that the ones central tend to be more vertical. As we get further to the edge, they tend to be a little bit more horizontal, responding to the arc of the lower eyelid, which is of course inbuilt from the volume of the eye itself. Frankly, the eyelashes, especially in the central section, which point straight upward, unless it's a very distinct part of that particular model that has to be put in for the story to be told, very often I won't do it. I'll add them here and I'll add eyelashes here. But in general, I have a strategy of avoidance. For me, I find that okay, but I'll try to explain how to draw them if you were going to. The first thing that I do is I look for the pattern of the eyelashes rather than the individual eyelashes themselves. I'll hatch along that area, allowing myself some searching lines to create a pattern for the values that I'll eventually draw. I'm going to do the same thing for the lower eyelashes. So now that I have my searching lines, I'm going to start to add a little bit shapes of the eyelashes as I see them, and also remove some of the searching lines where I feel they are less apparent. The eye socket itself is round, meaning that there is a curvature and a depth to the eye socket. Now, if the light is coming from the middle here, that means the inside corner and the outside corner are going to be darker than the middle section because there is form there, because there is roundness. Very often you're going to find this section here highlighted and the section above the eyebrow also highlighted. The volume of the eyeball itself, the roundness, the way that the eyelid covers the sphere of the eye, the way that it is pushed upward, it eventually flattens out as it gets past the margins of the sphere of the eye itself. If we can make that illusion convincing, a lot of what we need to do about the eye kind of falls together or is suggested by that roundness itself. So that's all for this lesson. Remember that if you found something in here practical and useful, there's a lot more where that came from. Not only in this particular lesson, but in all the other drawing and painting lessons that I've made for my Patreon students. If you follow the link in the description of this video, it'll take you directly to my Patreon page. You can subscribe for just $10, cancel anytime you want. And honestly, I think it's like the best value on the internet in terms of money you'll spend that will contribute directly to you drawing and painting better portraits. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. If you like the content on this channel, remember to like and subscribe so you get notified when I put out new lessons on YouTube. So yeah, that's it. See you in the next video.